Good morning in Washington. Good afternoon in Europe and Ukraine. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful special event for you this morning. We're going to talk about the visit of President Zelenskyy to Washington. Within a 36-hour period, President Zelenskyy went from the height of the war in Ukraine, the city of Bakhmut, which Moscow has still failed to take, to Washington to meet with the president, to meet with Congress. We have with us an extraordinary panel. We have RODA member Kira Rudik with us. We have former Deputy Secretary of State Steve Biegun with us. We have General Breedlove with us, and we have former National Security Advisor Steve Hadley. So I'll turn right into the conversation. We'll go a couple of rounds of questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So we'll start with Kira. Kira, why do you think President Zelenskyy came to Washington, and what did he achieve in coming?
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here. As a Ukrainian, I'm bursting with pride. And as a politician, I do understand that it was critical for us to finish the year with such an important event. We see that no matter how hard we are trying to say that the attention to Ukraine is not winding down, it is winding down indeed, especially closer to the holidays. However, we still need the support we are asking for. Since day one, we still need an ability to defend our skies. We still need an ability to march forward. And here in Ukraine, we are looking at the end of the year and planning for the next year, 2023, with hope and also with a huge threat, because you cannot plan for more than just a couple of days in advance. As of right now, 50% our energy infrastructure is being destroyed. I'm talking to you from my home in Kiev, where I'm running on diesel generator that may run out. So I apologize if I disappear for a couple of minutes, because I will have to put on my coat and boots and go outside and pour the diesel in. And I'm super happy that we have diesel. I'm sitting in the sweater because we are saving on everything. And I'm super lucky that we are having the connectivity today. And this is the reality that all Ukrainians are facing. And in lieu of the winter holidays, we all needed hope, a huge boost of hope. And this is what the president was giving, not only to Ukraine, but to the rest of the world. The summarizing on how well we fought this year, thanking to our allies for everything that we have received, and asking for more, asking for a chance to win this war next year. And this is something that we will definitely do if we will receive enough of the weapons and supplies. You know, it was so critical to show this link between the battlefield, where people are dying in enormous amount every single day, and fighting with enormous courage. And our strongest allies, the United States, repeating the story of Churchill, basically being the second wartime president ever visiting Congress and speaking to the Congress and talking to the President of the United States. It was an incredibly powerful move for many reasons. First, he is showing this comparison after Putin visited Belarus and said, look, I'm visiting my allies. Well, look, we are visiting our allies. Second, because he was able to show Ukrainian people we are not alone, once again, to close this concern that the world is tired of Ukraine, saying, look, Congress is doing 20 standing ovations. Nobody's tired, everybody's standing with us. No matter how hard it is here on the ground, we know that there is a hope, and that the support is coming right up. Third, it is important, even emotionally important, the point that President Biden and Congress committed to give us patriots. This is something that we have been begging for since the day one of the full-scale invasion, even a little bit earlier. And emotionally, this is something that every Ukrainian knows, like, oh, we need patriots, but for some reason we are not getting them, but we critically need them because it will allow us to physically survive. And every single time you hear an air raid siren, there is a thought, oh, if only we would have had patriots. Well, right now we are going to have them, and it will be a huge boost for morale. Also, I do hope that also on the emotional level, politicians from the other countries will follow through, that it will be a tipping point. So we really need tipping point and say like, okay, this is when the turning point happens. And we do want to hope that that was that. And I think President was able to turn everybody's heads that were already down into the Christmas presents and preparations into looking at what is still happening to Ukraine and giving us the support that we desperately need. I think that was a turning point. And I think this gives us the beam of hope that we need so much here on the ground.
Thank you, Kira. And it's hard not to smile at your blue and yellow visage. Okay. Deputy Secretary Began, President Biden used this visit to announce our provision of the Advanced Patriot Air Defense System and to underscore our support for Ukraine as long as necessary to defend themselves from Russian aggression. What are U.S. interests in defeating Kremlin aggression, and do you believe this visit is making a contribution?
Well, John, the visit was truly incredible, and the amazing bravery of President Zelenskyy to make that trip in the dangers that it represented, particularly traveling westward, just demonstrates the character of this leader who we have at this moment. It is in our interests. It's in American interests to support Ukraine at this moment. President Zelenskyy last night characterized it as not charity that he's seeking, but an investment by the United States. And it is an investment in our own freedom and in our own peace. Senator McConnell yesterday spoke to this as well, making clear that the aid the United States is giving Ukraine is not altruism. This is in our interests, in our American interests. Putin will not stop at Ukraine. We can say that with absolute certainty. He is driving west to reshape the security architecture of Europe in a manner that is suited to his system, to his regime. And what is that? It's dictatorship. It's undemocratic. It's intolerant. It's corrupt. It's thoroughly and irreparably corrupt. This is what Putin is seeking to drive westward to do. And if we don't stop him here, he's going to move further into Europe, and he's going to destabilize parts of Western Europe that are core American interests, as well as other parts of the world. But it's not just in American interests to stop him here. It's also consistent with our values. Putin has invaded a peaceful, democratic neighbor. It's just not in the character of the American people to remain indifferent to something so tragic. Imagine how we would feel. Imagine how we would have felt if the Russian military was parading in its dress uniforms that its officers brought in the initial invasion through the Maidan Square in victory over the Ukrainian people. And imagine the fate that would await the Ukrainian people in that instance if they had been defeated by Russia. We would be asking ourselves, what could we have done differently? Why didn't we do more? And we have a chance now to do exactly that.
Steve, thank you. Very eloquent. Okay, General Breedlove, you have followed the military situation in Ukraine closely going back to Moscow's launching of the war in 2014. The big takeaway from this visit, of course, is the Patriots and the new large congressional package of assistance. In your judgment, how is the war going, and what will be the impact of this visit on the battlefield? And also, Putin was just in Belarus. What are the prospects for new Kremlin offensive from there?
So, John, first of all, thanks for bringing us together and putting a voice to a very important event. And I would like to say, first and foremost, that I think that there was this feeling that the war was going to grind to a complete halt and that Russia would have a respite to begin to refit and refurbish and to take further action down the line. And I think we found exactly the opposite. Very proud of the Ukrainian military forces who have continued to put pressure on Russia, and in fact seem to be having some successes even in that hard-fought Bakhmut part of Ukraine. So hopefully now what we see is the fashioning of a strategic defeat for Mr. Putin in the south, like he suffered in the northwest of Kyiv, in Kharkiv, etc. And so, contrary to big concerns, Ukraine has been able to keep pressure on Russia through this time. Clearly, the muddy part of the winter slowed us down. We're now approaching the hard frozen ground part of the winter, which will allow more maneuver, and this continued support, which President Zelenskyy was able to negotiate, is going to be important to that next time. I'd like to just tell one small poignant part of this visit that some didn't see. Depending on your news outlet you follow, you may or may not have seen that President Zelenskyy gave our president a medal. And it was not a medal from Ukraine. It was not a medal from the government of Ukraine or the military of Ukraine. It was a medal that a young captain on the battlefield in Bakhmut the day before gave personally to President Zelenskyy when he heard he was going to be talking to the American president. So think of this, the toughest fight at this part of the war, the president of Ukraine is there on the ground in the middle of that toughest fight. A young captain hands him a medal and says, give this to President Biden. Couldn't think of a more poignant example of why what we're doing is so important in this part of the world. These brave people in this nation deserve our support, and the Patriots will be an important part of that. As far as the Belarusian piece, I think that Mr. Putin is desperate to change the narrative. He is desperate to strike fear in the West that there'll be a second front. He is desperate to send messages to Zelenskyy and others that he can cause now major havoc coming from the North. And while we do have to be somewhat cognizant of an actual threat there, I think we also need to understand that Mr. Putin's most effective weapon right now is fear. He has nearly fully deterred portions of the West, and we have to figure out how to work out from under that deterrence and enable Ukraine to win this war.
Thank you. Okay, National Security Advisor Hadley. Ukrainian officials are talking about a new Kremlin offensive late this winter or spring, perhaps, as we talked about with General Breedlove from Belarus. What should the U.S. and NATO be thinking about in preparing for such an offensive, and will this visit enhance our ability to manage a future Russian offensive?
Well, thank you, John, and thanks for pulling us together this morning. I agree with General Breedlove. I think Putin is using fear, but I fear that the threat of a renewed offensive to try to take Kyiv and topple the government is something we should just bet on is coming. If you looked at President Putin's statements yesterday, a meeting with his defense minister, talking about expanding the Russian army from 1 million to 1.5 million, new army brigades, new air combat units, his recent visit to Belarus, Putin is not going to stop. His goal is to eliminate Ukraine as an independent state and absorb it into Russia. That's what he wants to do. And I think we should just count on the major offensive could be coming. What do we do now? Well, what we need to do is to think through what Ukraine needs in terms of weapons, ammunition, tactics, other kinds of support. So when such an renewed invasion comes, and I fear that it will, he's in a position to manage it. And the question is, if we figure out now what he would need in the event of such an invasion, why would we wait until the invasion starts? We should get those materials, those equipment, those weapons, that training, other enabling support to the Ukrainians now, both to try to deter a Russian assault and to put them in a position to handle such a Russian assault, because we don't know when it might be coming. If we fail to do that, and such a Russian renewed assault comes and threatens the fall of Ukraine, the United States will have very difficult choices to make. Are we really willing, after all this effort, to let Russia take Ukraine? If not, it raises questions about whether we would put U.S. military forces in Ukraine to prevent that happening. That is a big idea, raises all kinds of questions. Would we do it alone? Would we try to do it with allies? Could we persuade our allies to come with us? Would NATO pass a resolution authorizing it over potential objections from countries like Hungary? Would we need some kind of UN approval, notwithstanding that that Russia sits at the Security Council with veto power? There are all kinds of very difficult questions that we would have to ask. We don't want to be there, which argues doing now and giving the Ukrainians now what they need so that if such a offensive comes, they are able to defeat it on their own terms without requiring US active support on the ground.
Well, you've given us quite a bit to think about, Steve. Let me ask you a quick follow-up question. So you seem to be saying, but I don't want to speak for you, that we have now a clear stake, maybe a vital stake in ensuring Ukraine does not fall into Russian control. Is that right?
That is right.
Okay.
And in order to ensure that it doesn't, it's in our interest to do everything now to give the Ukrainians what they need to be able to prevail in the event of such an invasion. Because if we don't, and it looks like an invasion occurs and is about to succeed, it puts some very difficult choices to this administration. And I would say to the administration, if you don't want to have to contemplate those difficult choices about US commitment on the ground, then it's time to make sure that Ukraine has now what it needs to defeat such an invasion, resumed invasion, when I think it comes.
Well, I think you've just given us the headline for out of this event. All right, Kira, I have a question. I see your hand is up. You can respond to that, of course, but well, if you want to respond to that, go ahead, and then I'll ask you the question I had in mind. But please,
so I want to thank Mr. Hadley for this statement, because this is basically what we have been saying for quite a while right now, and this is a change in the strategy that needs to happen. Because let me talk to you as you're just Ukrainian, not even a politician. Well, people ask me every single time when I'm talking to them, especially soldiers, if the world and President Biden knew that Putin would attack and was warning all of us that he would attack in winter, why it took like 10 months till we received the confirmation for Patriots and everything else? Why it's taking so long for these decisions to protect us to be made? And if we right now know that he's going to attack in spring, or we have these concerns, why there is no preparations, and why it's still the reactive politics? And I'm personally persuaded that the turning point and the victory will come not at the point when we will start winning at the battlefield, but when our allies will switch from this reactive paradigm, answering to what Putin is doing, to rather proactive paradigm, saying, okay, well, we have all the plans in advance, and we are really ready to what's going to happen. I remember 2 months ago when we were at Warsaw Security Forum, and where I met again General Breedlove, and you remember everybody was talking there about the Russian nuclear threats. And the only question that we were asking all our allies, people from different countries, saying, well, but do you have a plan already in place? What's going to happen if that will actually happen, if Russia would launch a nuclear missile onto Ukraine? And the answer was like, we are in works, we are thinking about it, it's very complicated, etc. But this is not something that we can afford right now, not after everything happened. And this is what we are calling to all our allies, saying, we understand that the downside of democracy, of being a democracy, is that things take time and you have to go through all the procedures and to have everybody involved. And Putin can launch his attack overnight because he just made this decision. But to overcome this downside, we have to have things prepared in advance. Because literally, like Mr. Hadley said, if we already know this, let's have everything prepared. Let's make sure that the previous investments are being just supported with new plans. And this is so critically important, because when you're talking to people on the ground here, these are simple questions that you have to answer, and not from the political standpoint, and not saying, oh, it's very complicated, but from the normal person's standpoint. Like, for example, today in the morning, I was at the meeting with women leaders, and they said, why did our allies allow 50% of our energy infrastructure to be destroyed before we started receiving air defense systems in larger quantities? And I honestly do not know what to answer, because it happened like 2 months ago, when we were like 8 months into the war, when the Russian attacks were actually clear, and the amount of the defense systems that we need were also clear. And everything that we are experiencing right now, all these hurdles, is the result that we were not able to protect our critical infrastructure objects. And even right now, if we get like 50 Patriots, it will still not return our energy infrastructure. And this is like a question that I do not have a proper answer for. I started saying that like Ukraine is such a huge country, and we wouldn't have air defense systems to protect all points of it. But let's prepare ourselves to not to have those strange questions like in spring, if something will happen.
Kira, thank you. Before I come back to you, I think Phil also wants to jump in on this issue. So go ahead, General Breedlove.
Just a very short remark. First of all, completely agreed with Steve and Kira. And to Steve's point about being ready for an invasion, we need to get some tough work done on policy, in that the worst way to fight an invasion is when it is amongst you and on top of you. We want to interdict this capability outside of Ukraine. We want to give Ukraine the ability to strike supply lines, approach routes, and forces before they get deployed in the field. And I think that our nation and our alliance needs to face these tough policy decisions to give Ukraine the offensive ability to strike these forces before they arrive on Ukrainian soil.
And John, may I just...
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, so everyone's been provoked by Mr. Hadley.
It's the right question. That's why. And in the right answer too. You know, the measure of success of President Zelensky's visit can be measured in 4 ways. If the delivery of weapons starting now is more, is better, is faster, and is longer range. More means anything and everything the Ukrainians need. I completely agree with General Breedlove. We have to move now to get the Ukrainians in a position to once again defeat Russian invasion, particularly from the north. Better means more sophisticated systems, smart bombs, Patriots, and other technologies. Faster means we need to front load these deliveries and get them into the country. We have to ramp up domestic defense production here in the United States in order to be able to follow through on this too. And longer, I think we need longer ranges. I think we certainly need to provide the Ukrainians with the ATACMS and other long-range weapons. There has to be a conversation between the United States and Ukraine about targets inside of Russia. But I would say, at a minimum, the United States should be prepared to approve and support Ukrainian attacks on military targets inside Belarus. If Belarus, once again, allows its territory to be used or allows its forces to be used as part of a new offensive from Belarus. Even if we aren't going to want the Ukrainians to strike in Russia for reasons of escalation, the Ukrainians should have the capabilities to destroy any military formations that are going to attack them from Belarus. And I think that has to be a priority. I'm very complimentary of President Biden's leadership. We've done the right thing almost at every turn, just half a step too slow. And now's the time we have to pick up our pace by that half a step to get ahead of the Russians.
Okay. Steve, just one quick question here. So also you would say we should give Ukraine the ability to strike anywhere within Ukraine, including Crimea, for which they need the longer range artillery and the ATACMS.
100%.
Okay, thank you. All right, because we'd had a very interesting and important exchange, we're a little bit short on time. So I'll ask the second round of questions, but please, short answers. So Kira, the massive Russian bombardment, which has you living on a generator, and you're lucky to have that generator, is designed to break the will of the Ukrainian people. Is it working?
No.
Okay, we'll leave it at that.
No, well, people are annoyed, I can tell you. And like every single thing is a challenge, like getting a warm cup of tea, going somewhere to meet somebody. You know, we already forgot how it is when there is no connectivity and you are sitting somewhere waiting for a person, not knowing if he's late, if he's not coming, if like something happened, if the buses all stopped. We are not fit to driving around a large city like Kiev without the traffic lights. Recently, my friend from the party called me crying because she lives on the 14th floor and she was carrying her toddler on her going up the stairs, and then she realized she forgot the keys in the car, and she's standing there thinking like, what am I going to do? And these things are, you know, they're piling. You're annoyed constantly because it's very hard to do stuff, even like on the very basic level. But we know that it's Putin's attempt to break us. Like almost everybody knows that. And then it's a matter of pride saying, well, we are annoyed, yes, but you are not breaking us. It's a matter right now of expanding your circle of responsibility. So you not only have to take care of yourself and your relatives, but also of people who are around you and who may need help. And this is something, again, super amazing that we did not expect of ourselves. I'm absolutely sure that we will go through the winter and that we will remain united inside the nation as well.
Thank you. And also inspiring. All right, Steve Biegun, you're a longtime Republican. You served with distinction in the Trump administration. We've seen growing opposition among the populist right of the Republican Party to standing up to Moscow's aggressive policy in Ukraine. Do you think this development could lead the U.S. to decrease assistance to Ukraine when the Republicans take the majority in the House in the next session? And what
John, let me unpack that a little bit.
Okay.
There's one dimension of it is the Congress. The other dimension is the Republican voices to which you're referring.
Okay.
Congressional involvement in support for Ukraine shouldn't be feared. In fact, it should be welcomed. Just this week, we should expect the United States Congress is going to vote to approve a budget of $47 billion for the Ukrainians. The president's request was $34 billion. So Congress has added nearly 20% to the president's request to give the Ukrainians exactly the type of support they need that we've been discussing today. And that's going to be paired with a defense budget of $858 billion, driven by Senator McConnell. $858 billion is a 10% budget increase. It's $45 billion above the president's requested amount, and it's enough money for the United States to focus on its priorities in China, as well as taking care of the concerns with Russia and all the rest of the world, our security interests as well. This is because of Congress. So we should welcome Congress coming in, and I certainly hope that every Republican senator supports Senator McConnell's achievements in the defense budget and in the Ukraine aid budget. That's the Congress. And Congress also has been pressing for more sophisticated and advanced weapons for Ukraine. The Congress has been a steady force to help the Ukrainians get what they need to defend themselves faster and in more capabilities. But there's also the Republican issue. And John, I joined the Republican Party in 1979, 43 years ago. It was during the candidacy of the most inspirational leader of my lifetime among American presidents, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan set the tone for Republican foreign policy in 1979, and I've proudly served in the last two Republican administrations in support of Republican foreign policy principles. Those principles are peace through strength, and they're the support for freedom where it is threatened. There's a small and noisy faction in the Republican Party that's going against these very Republican principles. As a Republican, I would say we need to refuse to cede the principles of our party's foreign policy to these voices. Ronald Reagan would be spinning in his grave. The Republican Party supports Ukraine. The Republican Party will continue to support Ukraine. And with the leadership of Senator McConnell, of leaders like Senator Risch and Congressman McCall, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I have every expectation that you have nothing to fear from a Republican-controlled Congress in the years ahead.
Okay.
John, can I give like a small note remark on
Kira, let's hold off now, get through the questions, then we'll have you a chance to speak. All right, Phil, during the press conference with President Zelenskyy, President Biden said that he was reluctant to give long-range fires to Ukraine because he was concerned, one, about the possible impact on our allies, and two, the possibility could lead to Russian escalation. What do you think of that explanation? And more importantly, what should the U.S. do with the request for more advanced weapons? And how might their provision affect the war?
So the short answer is we should be giving Ukraine the wherewithal to strike deeply into its opponent, because its opponent is enjoying the ability to strike into Ukraine from nearly 300 degrees on the compass, from the airspace of Belarus in the northwest all the way around to the sea space of the Black Sea in the southwest. Russia has in this war fired into Ukraine. And even in the face of this, we in the West seem to be, and we have limited Ukraine's ability to return fire. And that is no way to fight a war. We have essentially in the West endorsed sanctuary for Russia inside of Russia. And we seem to make public statements which enforce that and the audience is not only Russia, but our allies and our people, that we are not going to give the Ukrainians the ability to fire back into Russia. And that is not a war that I would want to fight as a wartime commander. I said in my earlier remarks, if we believe there is going to be, and I agree with Steve, if we believe there's going to be an invasion from the north, Ukraine will need to be able to strike that invasion before it crosses the border. We all understand how close Kyiv is to the border with Belarus, and we will have to strike it north. So I'm going to quit because you wanted short answers, but the bottom line is, yes, we need to be working with our allies and others for policies that allow Ukraine to do to Russia what Russia has been doing to Ukraine for nearly a year.
Thank you. Okay. Steve Hadley, there's regular talk among analysts and even some politicians about the need to start negotiations with Russia, even though, as President Biden said, Putin has no way changed his war aim to establish political control over Ukraine. There's some speculation that to reduce the chances of more losses on the battlefield, Putin might propose a ceasefire in place. How do you see the utility of negotiations or a ceasefire at this time? And what is necessary to achieve a just and stable peace for Ukraine?
So thank you, John. This problem with the ceasefire is that it basically allows Russia to sit on the territory it is occupied in Ukraine, refit its forces, and resume its invasion at the time of its choosing. So that's the problem with the ceasefire. Problem with negotiations is that Putin has shown no interest in negotiations. And by declaring that the 4 oblasts of Ukraine, which he has now declared are part of Russia, are non-negotiable, it has to be a starting point for any negotiation, he makes it almost impossible for President Zelenskyy to engage in negotiation. What would change Russia's calculus? If we were to give Ukraine the military capability it needs to be able to, for example, as an example, move into the Donbass in a way that would threaten the landline that Russia has now established between Russia and Crimea and put Crimea at risk, that may begin to change Putin's calculation and make him more willing to enter into some kind of negotiation. So oddly enough, if you want a negotiated outcome, we should be doing the things that the panelists have talked about to strengthen the ability of the Ukrainians to tip this war in its favor on the ground. When you think about negotiations, talking alone will not lead to a sustainable peace. If you want to have a negotiation, you need to decide what are your objectives in that negotiation, what kind of outcome would provide a sustainable peace, and ask yourself whether the situation on the ground and whether the positive and negative incentives you've arranged are likely to produce that kind of result. I haven't heard that kind of thinking from those who argue for negotiations now. One of the interesting things I think we saw a week or so ago was an article that appeared by Walter Russell Mead in the Wall Street Journal, and he set out what his objectives would be for a negotiated outcome. I want to run through them quickly. The war should end quickly. The war should end with a true peace. Fighting shouldn't just subside to resume later. The war should end in a way that makes clear that Russian aggression will not go unpunished. The end of the war should not set the stage for the next one. And we need an end state that does not result in the dismemberment of the Russian Federation. I may not endorse all of those, but they're a good starting point for thinking. And the challenge for a negotiated outcome is what kind of outcome could embrace and achieve all of those objectives. So there's a lot of intellectual thinking and work needs to be done as to what kind of negotiated outcome would preserve the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and result in a stable, sustainable peace in Europe. Not an easy task.
Thank you. Well put. All right. Kira, I cut you off, but if you have 2 minutes now to make the points you wanted to make, and then we're going to turn to audience questions. Please, 2 minutes.
I wanted to add that right now in Ukraine, everybody's turning their heads to President Reagan because there was an article about him that even in 80s, he was claiming that there should not be a gas pipeline built in Europe from Russia because it will create an enormous influence in Russia and then will lead to another world war. And he is being quoted on that like a lot right now. And I just wanted to add to your point, Mr. Began.
Okay, thank you. All right, we have 24 audience questions. We'll start with one from Mark Berenson. How much does the conduct of the war in 2023 depend upon whether the leadership in the White House, Pentagon, and State Department believe that Ukraine can take back Crimea? Steve, since you were a deputy at State Department not that long ago, I'll give you this question. Steve Began, give this question to you.
Yeah, I think that's not the primary question that will affect the thinking of the administration. I have to say that if I was organizing the concerns of what I understand administration's concerns to be in order, the first would be attacks on Russian proper. The second would be the conquest of Crimea, and the third would be a capture of a whole Russian army, a large number of Russian soldiers, that they would see those as circumstances that could potentially provoke an escalation by Putin. But that is not going to affect the thinking of the Biden administration, in my view, on what support to give the Ukrainians now. Those are endgame questions, and we need to be prepared ourselves for that moment, as we have for 75 years with our own deterrent, because Russia will get more dangerous at that point. The near term is simply putting the Russians on the defensive, keeping them on the defensive, getting the Ukrainians on the front foot. My one concern, John, is we really need to stop playing for a draw. I think we need to be very clear on what our objective here is, which is the defeat of Russia.
Thank you. All right. We have a question from Jack Krupansky about Patriots. So this is, I think, for you, Phil. He starts out by saying, can a single Patriot system protect more than a single major city? And might not 2 or even 3 Patriot systems be needed to protect each of the major cities in Ukraine, accounting for maintenance, downtime, and raw numbers of missiles and drones Russia might throw?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's an informed question, because while the Patriot is an amazing system and has some really good coverage, it is essentially a point defense weapon. And it will not, one battery will not be able to protect all the targets that we need to protect inside of Ukraine. I think the most important thing about our contribution of this Patriot is that it breaks a policy barrier that I think some of our allies were adhering to, and that is the United States is not sending any capability to Ukraine. Why should we lean into that? And maybe now, by the United States sending Patriots, we'll see other nations become more prolific in this type of weapon, because it will take more. And to close, I use a phrase a lot: with just a small amount of air defense, you have to be brutally prioritizing where you put it. And then you have to brutally prioritize what you're going to shoot at. This system is capable against fixed-wing aircraft, tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and others, and that's what it should probably be saved for. What we don't want to be doing is shooting Patriot missiles at $50,000 drones. We've got to figure out how to enable Ukraine to handle the drones and use the high-end capabilities of Patriot against those other systems which are challenging Ukrainian airspace.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Ion Kavanaugh. It is, according to today's Polish press, the head of the Bundestag's Defense Commission is now calling for the delivery of Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine in collaboration with allies. What can be done to assure such voices in the Bundestag receive visible and clear endorsement from the US to allay the NATO coordination concerns so often referenced by Chancellor Scholz? Steve Hadley, would you want to give a try to that question?
You know, I read in the press the other day that Germany's position was they want to support Ukraine. They don't want this war to escalate into a war between NATO and Russia on the ground, and they don't want to be alone. And that apparently, the third item there, I think, is addressed, as General Breedlove said, by the giving of Patriots. If it's clear that the United States is willing to give these kind of high-end capabilities, that makes it much more likely that our allies will be willing to do so. That's why the Patriot weapon system is symbolically so important, and hopefully that will unlock the Germans and be more willing to provide the kinds of capabilities that Ukraine needs.
Okay, Steve Began, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, John, it's just a tired debate that we've been going round and around. And oftentimes part of the argument against providing these systems to the Ukrainians is it's going to take too long to train them up, that by the time they are capable of operating them, it'll be past the moment. What we should be doing is training the Ukrainians up in all of these systems now, even if we haven't yet approved delivery to Ukraine. So the Patriot system, for example, 6 to 9 months to train up a 90-man battery to get that going. I don't know if my math is right, but it will take a while to ship. Why don't we train the Ukrainians now in the M1A1 Abrams main battle tank, so that when the time comes where we need to deploy that, which is already probably yesterday, and the same with the Leopold from Germany, that they have capable operators able to use them when that political decision is made. It seems to me that we're missing an opportunity. You know, Wayne Gretzky famously said, "Don't pass the puck to where the skater is, pass the puck to where the skater's going." We have got to get ahead of the Russians here by thinking ahead on how we can make the quick delivery of systems like that possible.
There's a follow-up question on this subject from Klaus Beckman. So Phil, I'll ask you, why doesn't Biden deliver the Abrams tanks?
It goes back to what has been discussed by several of the panelists. We are, and I'll use the word, we are deterred in many ways. Anything that we have that has the slightest chance of appearing offensive, we are deterred from giving them. Thus, we're having a conversation about Patriots because it's easy to label them as defensive, yet we won't have a conversation about ATACMS because it sounds offensive. And so this is all about a policy barrier that we have to break through. And it goes back to my last premise. If we're building sanctuary for Russia, we are hamstringing Ukrainians' ability to defend its country.
Okay, thank you. We have, a question from Brian Slater. It's somewhat complicated. What are the panelists' opinions on the European NATO perspective of the US entering with direct weapons investment in Ukraine? How does it change the EU roles in their strategic analysis and support for Ukraine? Certainly, US moves have an effect on how all players respond. Hey, Phil, go ahead.
So I'm not an economist or a businessman, but as a military person, this is important that someone begins to work with Ukraine to build long-term capability. Once this war is over, hopefully and it will end in a way that Ukraine is happy with what it has. But once it's over, Ukraine's going to have to be able to defend itself into the future, and starting back a capable military industrial set of companies that will be able to produce for Ukraine what it needs for its long-term defense is important. And so I hope that the European nations are a huge part of this and I would actually really encourage that they take lead. But if not, if the US starts, maybe that will again start the wider involvement and investment in Ukraine's future.
Okay, thank you. Steve Hadley, you want to jump in here?
I do. I want to just elaborate on something Phil said, and Phil can correct me if I'm misunderstanding. I want to just be clear. What we're talking about is giving Ukraine the capability not to rain fire on civilian Russian cities and towns the way Russia is raining fire on Ukrainian cities and towns. That's not what we're talking about. But what we're talking about is if there are Russian military forces that are sitting in Belarus or sitting in Russia and that are killing Ukrainians, military forces and civilians, Ukrainians ought to be able to respond and take out those forces. Similarly, as Phil and Steve Began were saying, if we see a Russian buildup in Belarus that indicates that invasion from Belarus is about to start, you have to give the Ukrainians the ability to disrupt that invasion before it occurs. So this is not a green light for Ukraine to attack civilian infrastructure in Russia. That's not what this is about. It's about giving Ukraine the ability to defend itself.
Phil, I see you want to jump in again.
Violent agreement. This is exactly right. Well said. And frankly, Ukraine has shown great discipline in the way they have used the weapons that we've provided for them. We should be trusting them in these matters. And Steve said it exactly right. They have shown this discipline. And what we're talking about is striking the military capability of Russia before it is able to affect the Ukrainian landmass.
Kira, I have a question for you in a second, but I just want to raise one more point. This is actually not from the audience. This is not from the audience. Luke Coffey at Hudson came up with the idea of supporting Ukraine against a possible Belarus-based strike by having snap NATO exercises in the Baltic area. Phil Breedlove, what do you think about that?
I'm sorry, John, restate it. I had a breakup in my system.
Luke Coffey has suggested that a good way to support Ukraine against a possible strike from Belarus is for NATO to hold snap military exercises in the Baltic Sea area. What do you think of that idea?
So this is the old adage of widen the problem, to geographically give Russia a problem. It might work, but I don't believe that some of our NATO allies will favor widening the conflict or widening the problem for Russia. I don't take umbrage with the question or the question asker. My focus is on getting Ukraine the support they need, steady supply of the supply lines they have now, and these new capabilities to better defend themselves with offensive capability.
Okay, thank you. Kira, this is from Plamen Pontiff. What are the expectations of Ukraine for help coming from its closest countries, closest partners?
It honestly did not change since the very beginning. We need to have enough defense weapons to protect and defense systems to protect our cities. So the key expectation is that at some point we would not be waking up of the air raid sirens, or if we would be waking up, we would know that you have like 95% chance of the missiles not hitting us. And that will allow our economy to start kind of raising a little bit on the western part. It will allow us to preserve the remaining 50% of our infrastructure. It will allow us not being afraid of the further destruction by Russia. Because another question that I was not able to answer today on the meeting with women leaders is like, okay, we are so lucky we have diesel generators, but what happens if they destroy diesel supplies? Like, how are we going to go? So this is the key point for us, is to help us defend ourselves. This is the first one. Second is allow us to regain our territories. So we need more weapons and supplies to regain our territories. Third point is, of course, the financial support. Every single month, we have a $5 billion gap just to continue surviving, continue floating, I would say. And this is being covered by different programs by our allies. And this will have to continue to go because we are not being a country that is having any prospects of economy rebuilding in the next 2 or 3 months, or getting those money in different ways. And well, another point that is a personal point is that the help from our allies would be seizing Russian assets and using them for the sake of Ukraine. $500 billion throughout the world. Russian central bank assets, including oligarch assets. This is something that could cover for most of the expenses that the country is having right now to support Ukraine. And this is something that we are fighting so hard. And you know, this is actually so amazing that 4 months ago, everybody was saying, oh, it is impossible. You remember, John, we were like having meetings and people were saying, it is impossible. It's never going to happen. It's not something that the country would do. Well, guess what? Canada have voted for the legislation. And just 2 days ago, they seized Abramovich's assets, and now they're going to use them for the help to Ukraine. And recently we've been to London, where all the members of all the parties that are in the parliament confirmed that they will support the idea, and we are like looking at the mechanisms right now. So this is one of the ways, and this is something that I think will be incredibly important, not only for Ukraine, but also for the rest of the dictatorships that are looking around and seeing how the world reacts, because this is hitting where it hurts.
I agree, and it's necessary to talk to people in Congress about that too. All right, we have a very interesting question from an anonymous attendee of our event. I think this would go for you, Steve Hadley. The question is this: what is your view about Dmitry Medvedev's visit to China and President Xi's meeting with him? And will the Russia-China relationship change the dynamics of the Ukraine war?
China's been very interesting in struggling on this issue. They, of course, met with the two presidents, President Xi and President Putin, met before the Beijing Olympics and had this open-ended partnership that they declared. And then within 2 weeks, Russia had gone into Ukraine, which I think the Chinese had not contemplated. China's been doing a straddle. It doesn't want to break with Russia. On the other hand, it's loath to, and it defends the Ukrainian invasion by Russia as basically blaming it on the West. But on the other hand, China does not want to provoke a war with the United States, an economic war with the United States, and therefore has been respecting the financial sanctions, and its companies have been respecting the export limitations that the U.S. has imposed on exports to Russia of things related to U.S. origin. So China is trying to straddle, and I think you've seen increasingly it being uncomfortable with this war. Xi is now talking very openly when he meets with other leaders about the importance that nuclear weapons not be used, should not be threatened. So I think what you have not seen, the reason Russia is getting drones from Iran is because it's not able to get drones from China. China does not provide military assistance. And I don't think under the current circumstances, particularly with the domestic economic problems that China has, I don't see China changing its policy. I don't see it breaking with Russia, but I also don't see it coming in behind Russia.
Thank you. I think that when Ukraine wins this war and Putin loses, historians will see that China-Russia declaration in early February of last year as the high watermark of an authoritarianism which began to recede shortly thereafter. thanks largely to Ukrainian courage and Western support for that. Okay, we've got time, I think, for one more question. It comes from Steve Schinkel. He says, I believe that the US West should seriously consider an imposition of a no-fly zone over part, if not all, of Ukraine to help with defense from cruise missiles and shooting them down. Is this a valid course of action? Phil, I'll give that one to you, and others can comment as well in the little time we have left.
Well, I'll speak out both sides of my mouth. Militarily, it is a valid option, but politically and geopolitically, I don't think it's a valid possibility. And we've been through this before. You and I have worked with the White House and others to try to consider no-fly zones for even partial portions of Ukraine, et cetera, and there is strong objection to having Western forces directly engaging Russians. And while I don't agree, I understand their position. So militarily, it is a valid option. Geopolitically, I don't think it's going to make it. And
Steve,
we'll
I see
let the
your
real expert here, Steve, will answer.
I see your hand is up. You've been calling for new thinking, so I think we're going to hear some new thinking right now on this subject. Please.
Well, I don't think so. But look, the best way, the most efficient, the most effective way to have a no-fly zone is to give the Ukrainians the weapon systems they need to create a no-fly zone themselves and enforce it themselves.
Thank you, Steve. This is what we have been saying for a while right now. We are saying, do not come to fight for us. We are okay. Just give us everything and we will do our job.
Kira, the last word has been yours. Thank you all for participating in this conversation. Thank for those who listened in. We'll be doing more work on this subject. And in fact, in the new year on January 12, we're going to be hosting a conversation with Boris Johnson to talk about supporting Ukraine, how this is vital for the West. Thank you all for participating today, and we'll see you in the new year.
Thank you, John.
Glory to Ukraine.
Inshallah.